Hey everyone, we're about to dive into a book that is, in my opinion, one of the more complex and complicated books. It has a lot of depth, and so we're breaking this down into a couple of parts. We're still going to do the Zoom calls and at the normal times for class, but we're also having these videos just as kind of a supplement because I think sometimes we water down scripture. I'm not just talking about getting an eagle-eye view. I'm talking about we don't always see the depth and the beauty of the poetry and the narrative and what's really happening. So the first chapter, the first part, we're going to have chapters 1 through 6 with a sneak peek at 7, and then we're going to dive in part 2 and 7 to the 12. So a few things to know. This is written right after Jerusalem has fallen. So this is a complex part, and it's integral to so much of the Old Testament. But you have the map, really crude map of Israel up north and Judah down south, Judah having Jerusalem. Israel falls first because they didn't have a lot of good kings, and we covered this all in class, and so we'll dive into it a little bit more. But this follows a group of people that are taken after the Babylonian siege. And it is a personal vendetta of mine, challenge of mine, to get us back to their Hebrew names. So we call them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But their real names, their Hebrew names, are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so we follow them and Daniel, who they all have their names switched. Daniel has his name switched to Belteshazzar. And so that means roughly that their God protects, right? So we're going to see a lot of that narrative play out. A couple of things that it changes a lot in Daniel. This is another thing that we're going to be following. In chapter 1, it's a late date Hebrew, and we're going to really explore what that means. But it starts off in Hebrew, and then suddenly it switches from 2 to 7 into Aramaic, and then another from 8 to 12 to late Hebrew, like a Hasmonean period. We're going to get into that too. But I just want you to have this to know going in. The language plays a huge factor in how we read this. Background shows us the Judean exile and what happens there. And we're going to be exploring something that I think is fascinating. History versus meta-history. And what I mean by that is we talk about storytelling in very blanket terms. Historical, this is what happened. I have no influence in what it is. This happened, and this happened. Those are the facts. That is not how they told history back then. In fact, we're going to see some names that are wrong. We're going to see some dates that are wrong. We're going to see, just for instance, it starts off with the wrong king's name, and it focuses on Nebuchadnezzar, which isn't actually the king that is reigning during this time. We're gonna dive into what that means more, but be aware that this is a book that really fights history versus meta-history. So let's dive in. So one of the big things is chapter 1. Now this is where we blaze through what's happening. So chapter 1 is the introduction of Daniel and his friends into the palace life of Nebuchadnezzar. And so what they do is they took the most handsome, the most talented, the smartest men, and they would bring them in and educate them for 3 years on their history, their culture, their techniques. And it's a way of kind of assimilating this culture and hopefully overtaking it and putting your own in its place. So that's where we see the first chapter, and through the power of veganism, we're going to, I keep on saying we're going to dive into this, but trust me, this is just the overview. So I'm going to stop saying that from here on out, but know that we will be getting into more. So first chapter, they refuse to take the king's food, and at first the people that are in charge of them are like, you're going to look bad. Ultimately, God protects them. They are even stronger than the people that are around them, and they rise in the ranks. So then we go into chapter 2, and there's this dream that the king has, and he's like, what's happening? Someone needs to explain this dream. Super distressed. And he lays out this rule. He says, unless you can tell me what the dream is and interpret it, I'm going to kill every single wise man in Babylon. Pretty big gauntlet to throw down. Daniel comes after praying to God, and he says, here is what it is. It's a super rough drawing, but it's this giant statue, and the head is of gold, and the torso is silver, the kind of skirt is bronze, the legs are iron, and the feet are clay and iron, this weird mixture. And Daniel tells him what it means. says the head is gold. That's because that's Babylon. It looks beautiful, and it kind of dives down in quality from there. Persia, silver a little bit less. And basically, they're each going to conquer the one before them. And then Greece is going to rise up with this bronze. And Rome is iron, which is this harsh, destroys all things. And then we're going to see the Roman Empire divide. And that's why it's mixed with clay, brittle and strong. And so we start seeing the divide of the empire. And this random stone broken off comes and destroys the statue and forms a mountain in its place. And instead, a mountain starts growing. So an important theme that we're going to see throughout Daniel is that man's kingdoms don't last. God's kingdoms do. And so while they are making these gold and silver and bronze decadent statues, which is the most beautiful from the top down, the feet are the most vulnerable. Whereas God, the church, is this mountain, the stone that breaks it and then turns into a mountain, which is strongest from the base. So that's mostly what happens in chapter 1. Chapter 2, that's the thing that we all know, where it's, we call them again, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get thrown into a fire for not bowing down to an idol. So, again, the names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they're thrown in there, and we see this glowing figure, the Son of Man, one that looks like a Son of God, as it says, and they are not burned. And he praises God, and the king does, and he decrees that all of Babylon should worship this God. So that's chapter 3. Chapter 4, there's another dream that happens, and Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar what's going to happen is, so there's this giant tree that grows up, and it's chopped down, and essentially just breaking it down very, very quick. Daniel says that you are going to go mad for 7 years. You're going to become like a beast, and you're going to be running around. Your kingdom will not be yours. Your kingdom will be chopped down in its prime, and the roots only will be left. So the story, what we're going to see more, and it has a very interesting historical tie. We actually have a prayer from the king that this is actually based on, and we see some very interesting things written, including that they went mad for multiple years, and that the actual writing says an exorcist from the Jews exorcised this demonic ulcer. Side note, we're going to get into that. So then you have that whole narrative that goes on, okay? So then now what? That's chapter 2, that's chapter 3, that's chapter 4, and we're going to see chapter 5. And at this point, we see a new character. The king, Belshazzar, has taken over. And we see him taking golden goblets that he stole from the temple in Israel, and he brought back. And he brings those out for his party guests to drink. So they're taking these sacred vessels, and they're drinking and they're partying. And suddenly a hand appears out of nowhere, and it starts drawing on the wall, and it draws this phrase, many, many tekel parsons, and they don't know what it means. And they bring Daniel in, and Daniel lets them know that it's this series of words, and it's actually a pun, because all three of those are monetary, have monetary value, and it's in descending order. But it's basically, you have been measured and weighed and found wanting. And it's at that time that the Babylonian Empire falls overnight, and the Persian Empire sneaks in and essentially kills everyone. Again, we have some historical notes and some historians that have written about this. And this actually is a real night that it's happened, and we know about it. And from the Persian side, they said, yeah, the kings were drunk, all of the guards were drunk. It was really weird, and we'd been sneaking in. But the next thing that we see is Daniel in a new empire. Again, Daniel has lasted throughout this, but the empires have shifted. So we've gone from the Babylonians to the Persians, and the Persians, we see this king, where it's Darius the Mede, which is kind of a play on words of the king that it's actually based on, Cyrus the Mede. And all of the advisors are kind of jealous of Daniel, so they come up with this thing where we've heard a lot of this story, where they say, hey, you need to write a decree that anyone who prays to anyone other than our gods for the next 30 days is going to be thrown into the lion's den. Darius is like, sure, that sounds great, seals it, and they said, ha, we got him. So they bring Daniel, and the king actually hates this. He loves Daniel, and he tries to fight for him, but it's the Persian rule that they can't overturn a decree. So Daniel's thrown in the lion's den, and it's horrifying. They think everyone's dead. They wait a night. The king can't eat. He can't sleep. And he goes there first thing in the morning, and Daniel's untouched. And then the thing we don't always talk about, so to punish the men who schemed this, he grabs all of the advisors and their families, including children, and throws them in the lion's den in his place. Okay, and so there's so much metaphor, and I'm really excited to dive into this with you guys. But Daniel part 1, those are chapters 1 through 6. Just, those are narrative. These are all stories, we call them court tales. At chapter 7, we see things shift into apocryphal writings, and the writing of Daniel completely changes. So for now, this is Daniel part 1.